The 7th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment was designated a service battalion, meaning that it was raised specifically for the duration of the war. When the British Empire joined the Great War in August 1914, the British Secretary of State for War, Lord Herbert Kitchener, quickly realised that the war was likely to be long, and that the existing British army was not nearly large enough to fight a land war against the significantly larger Central Powers. In response, he started the process of raising a sequence of new armies from mid-August 1914, which are often referred to as Kitchener's Army or even Kitchener's Mob. The response to Kitchener's famous call to arms around Bedfordshire was both instant and enormous. The 7th Battalion was formed at Bedford as part of the Second New Army, dubbed K2, with Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Martin being the battalion's first commanding officer from its formation on the 6th of September 1914, until Lieutenant Colonel Edward de Rory Pickard Cambridge assumed command from the 30th of December 1914. Following the transfer of 1,000 officers and men from the 6th Service Battalion, the newly formed 7th Battalion was initially attached to the 15th Scottish Infantry Division as divisional troops while training in and around Haslemere in Surrey. On the 25th of February 1915, the battalion moved to Colchester and transferred into the 54th Infantry Brigade of the 18th Eastern Infantry Division, where they remained for their entire war. The 18th Division was formed from the 53rd, 54th and 55th Infantry Brigades, who were all formed from battalions drawn from East Anglia, the home counties, South East and South Central England. While the 7th Bedfordshires were in the 54th Brigade, the following battalions formed the brigade and served together as a tactical unit: the 7th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment, the 6th Battalion of the Northamptonshire Regiment, the 11th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, and the 12th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment until they were disbanded in February 1918. Their division, initially commanded by Major General Ivor Maxey, would forge a reputation as a hard-fighting, extremely effective unit, and were involved in breaking some particularly difficult German positions during the war. On the 15th of April 1915, Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Heathcote Allenby took over, and from May 1915 the battalion trained on and around the Salisbury Plains. Lieutenant Colonel George Dominic Price assumed command on the 10th of June, with his predecessor moving to command the 7th Royal Scots Fusiliers, where he would be killed in France 2 months later. On the 26th of July 1915, the battalion boarded trains at Codford, bound for Folkestone, where they were loaded onto the troop ship SS Onward. After an overnight crossing, the following morning found them disembarking at Boulogne-sur-Mer, before marching on to the Ostronov rest camp. The 7th Battalion would spend their entire war in France and Flanders, between their arrival in July 1915 and their disbandment in August 1918. On the evening of the 27th of July, they entrained to Flesselles, just north of the major military railhead at Amiens, and weeks later started being fed into the trenches for instruction in the Somme sector of the British portion of the Western Front. Although not involved in any major battles over the first 10 months of their overseas deployment, aggressive patrolling, domination of no man's land and raiding of their counterparts' trenches became their focus, interspersed with spells in support and reserve to continue honing their training. The glutinous mud and enormous trench rats added to their overall comfort, but trench life nevertheless continued uninterrupted, and in June 1916 their entire division were finally kitted out with steel helmets, just in time for the first big test. The 7th Bedfordshire's first taste of full-scale set-piece battle was during the battles of the Somme 1916, specifically within the Battle of Albert, which on the infamous opening day, the 1st of July 1916, saw the Bedfords in the first assaulting wave. Their divisional commander, Ivor Maxey, had positioned his troops in no man's land overnight, and in doing so the Bedfordshires and other assaulting battalions in their division were able to reach the German trenches with enough men to enable them to break into the first line and, for the most part, keep up with the artillery timetable. As a result, they were one of just 2 British divisions which captured and held all of their objectives, advancing a remarkable 3,000 yards that day, with the 7th Bedfordshires forming the 54th Brigade's right assaulting battalion and storming the notorious Pommier Redoubt in their sector. In spite of the innovative tactics, the cost was still high. The Bedfordshires had to fight hard for the successive trench lines, which saw them losing over 320 officers and men during the assault. Although the division was also engaged at Trones and Delville Wood that month, the Bedfordshires were in brigade reserve as they were rebuilt, followed by a spell of training hard in a quiet part of the line between Ypres and Loos. By the end of July, the 7th Bedfordshire's first anniversary dinner celebrating their arrival in France saw just 12 officers left from the original cadre, and despite reinforcements arriving that month to replace their battle losses, a parade that day saw the battalion just 29 officers and 650 men strong. The 18th Division returned to the Somme for the Battle of Thiepval in September to capture the reportedly impregnable Thiepval village and Schwaben Redoubt that had cost the 36th Ulster Division over 5,000 casualties on the 1st of July 1916. The Bedfords were in brigade reserve during the opening phase of the assault, and although the 54th Brigade's 3 other battalions captured the first half of Thiepval, they had taken heavy casualties and had become badly mixed up in the fighting. Overnight on the 26th of September 1916, the Bedfords were called forward to take over the line in the pitch darkness, and 2 companies captured the remaining sector of the village at dawn on the 27th, which they did with no artillery preparation and by the point of the bayonet, even advancing several hundred yards beyond the village limits and into no man's land. The next day the division carried the assault on despite most of its battalions being spent. The Bedford's 2 fresh companies were all the 54th Brigade had available, so provided the assaulting waves in their sector. They were heavily engaged in vicious close quarters fighting, capturing the greater part of the Schwaben Redoubt along with the mixture of troops from other battalions around them. During the battle, Second Lieutenant Tom Adlam, a school teacher from Wiltshire, won the Victoria Cross for leading his men from the front during the attack in spite of multiple wounds. 15 officers and around 200 men were lost in the fighting, being almost half of the battalion's men who started the assault. The division rebuilt and returned to training in readiness for the next operations, with Lieutenant Colonel George Pilkington Mills assuming command of the 7th Bedfordshires from the 18th of October 1916. The battalion were also present during the Battle of the Ypres in November, although after intense operations for an attack had been hurriedly carried out, they were relieved before the order to advance was given, so were employed in an entirely supporting role in the end. On the 15th of January 1917, the division's commander, General Ivor Maxey, was promoted, being replaced by Richard Lee, who would go on to command the division until the end of the war. That winter, the 18th Division were engaged during the operations on the Ypres, including the actions of Miramont in February and pursuing the German retirement to the Hindenburg Line in March. During the March operations, stretcher-bearer Private Christopher Cox won the battalion's 2nd Victoria Cross while rescuing dozens of wounded men under heavy fire on the open slopes in front of Achy-le-Grand. The battalion was next called on during the Battle of Arras in 1917. On the 3rd of May 1917, the 18th Division were checked for the first time when the right flank of their assault on the German positions around Cherisy during the Third Battle of the Scarpe was held up. After a rushed plan and artillery bombardment which failed to cut the thick belts of wire, the 7th Bedfordshires and half of the 12th Middlesex were pinned in front of the unbroken wire in no man's land. As the left of the division advanced on their objectives, the Bedfordshires and bulk of the Middlesex spent the day pinned in shell holes, being incessantly enfiladed by intense machine gun fire and heavy shelling. By the day's end, the battalion had lost a further 240 officers and men. After a summer of more rebuilding and retraining, the division returned to the Ypres salient in July, ready for their part in what would be called the Battles of Ypres 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele. The Bedfordshires were engaged during the capture of Westhuyck, when on the 10th of August 1917 they were one of the 18th Division's 3 assaulting battalions who attacked Glencourse Wood and Inverness Copse. Given the incredibly difficult ground and task appointed to them, the Bedfords captured their objective against all odds but found themselves isolated, as the battalions on either side had understandably fared badly. Nevertheless, they fended off intense counter-attacks and that night handed over their line to their relief. Although they were advised they would be spared any further involvement, B Company from the battalion was called into the fighting again on the 16th of August, but after a friendly fire incident which took around half of the company out, the attack was called off. The battalion was moved into reserve to resume training and rebuild again, having lost a further 260 casualties. Although the division was again involved in the First Battle of Passchendaele in October, the 7th Bedfordshires was spared any direct involvement, but would spend their winter in the northernmost sector of the British line, in what remained of Houthulst Forest. Even by the standards of the Western Front, the forest was a particularly unpleasant place. The water table in the area was naturally high, and any drainage had long since been destroyed, so the area was nothing more than a swamp of rotting wood and decaying corpses, the combined smell carrying for miles. The front line, such as it was merely a collection of shallow shell holes, reinforced by rotting wood barricades, as trenches were impossible to create due to the ground being nothing more than oozing slime. Night movement was impossible as the risk of falling into the swamp and drowning was far too high, so any movement was carried out in daylight under full view of the ever-watchful enemy gunners. As trench foot cases rose significantly, stints in the front line were reduced to 24 hours, making the daily daylight reliefs hazardous and costly. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Ernest Percival took command of the battalion from the 18th of January 1918, and yes, this is the same Arthur Percival who went on to have a long, distinguished and highly decorated military career, going on to command the ill-fated Singapore garrison from 1941 and spending the rest of the Second World War as a Japanese prisoner of war. The British Army was reduced in size to address its serious manpower shortage early in February 1918, and infantry brigades were reduced from 4 to 3 battalions. In this shake-up, the 54th Brigade lost the 12th Middlesex, leaving just the 7th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment, the 6th Battalion of the Northamptonshire Regiment, and the 11th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. By mid-February 1918, the 18th Division, now a part of the British Fifth Army, had been moved to the southernmost tip of the British sector of the Western Front, taking over the new section of the line from the French, north of La Fère. They had to man a sector far too large, with nowhere near enough troops, and despite their best efforts to prepare the area for the attack that everyone knew was coming, the British defences were just not ready when the German spring offensives hit the British Fifth Army on the 21st of March 1918. The 7th Bedfordshires were heavily engaged during the first battles of the Somme 1918, and although the 18th Division once again wreathed itself in glory, the cost was really high. By the time orders arrived on the 23rd of March for the 54th Brigade to retire from their stubborn stand along the Crozat Canal between Cherisy and Menessy, the 7th Bedfordshires and 6th Northamptonshires could only muster 200 officers and men each. Less than 20 of the 11th Royal Fusiliers reported for roll call that night. Until the 6th of April, the badly battle-worn battalion, like those around it, was bolstered by a stream of stragglers collected from the flotsam of the chaotic battle who were folded into their ranks and collectively did what they could to stem the German advance. The Bedfords were involved in a series of defensive actions, counter-attacks and hasty moves, until being relieved by French units and bussed into defensive positions in front of Amiens. After 2 weeks' rest, rebuilding and refitting, they were once again in action at Villers-Bretonneux on the 24th of April, losing 200 more men, but winning the highest praise for their spirit and endurance during the fighting. On the 27th of May 1918, as part of another major reduction to the size of the British Army following its losses during the German spring offensives, the 7th Battalion ceased to exist as a fighting unit. A cadre formed from a selection of 7th Battalion officers and NCOs would train American units over the summer, but the remaining officers and men were transferred into the 2nd Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment, which itself was moved into the 54th Infantry Brigade in place of the 7th Battalion. And in August 1918, the training cadre was broken up, at which time the 7th Battalion was formally disbanded. The 7th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment won a well-deserved reputation within the 18th Infantry Division, which was itself recorded by German intelligence in 1917 as being among the British Army's top assault divisions. During the Great War, the 7th Battalion lost around 830 men killed in action, and between 2,000 and 3,000 additional casualties, depending on the source you read.